In the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing, we cover the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Mei Long. This case was incredibly tragic because not only did a young girl lose her life in a brutal fashion, but had there been an arrest in the weeks after her murder, many lives would have been saved. That's because she was killed by an incredibly vicious serial killer who would go on to kill over a dozen people. You can find Into the Killing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you listen to great podcasts. But before we start today's video, we just want to take a moment to talk about our fantastic sponsor, Magellan TV. I don't know about you, but at this point, I'm bored with a lot of streaming services. That's why I love Magellan TV, because there's always a new great documentary to watch. A really interesting, but deeply disturbing documentary I just watched is called Murdered Online. It details the brutal murder of a woman. She was kidnapped and killed after showing up for a job that was posted online. Tragically, her killers have never been brought to justice. There are a ton of other great true crime documentaries on Magellan TV, and they also have some fascinating history documentaries. A really interesting one I just watched is called Qualyle, Paranoia and Brutality in Ancient Rome. I always thought that Qualyle was a fascinating historical figure. This documentary is a great look at one of the most infamous people who ever lived. These are just two great documentaries you can find on Magellan TV. They also have a bunch of amazing documentaries that are available in 4K, and they are stunning to watch. Right now is a great time to sign up for Magellan TV. Criminally Listed viewers can now take advantage of an exclusive offer of 30% off an annual membership. That means you could get access to over 3,000 documentaries for just $3.50 a month. Simply click on the link in the description to claim your discounted annual membership today. If you've been watching with me and you let your subscription lapse, you can still claim this offer. Check out Magellan TV because you'll find something great to watch and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed in the process. Number 3. Gayle Barrus. In the fall of 1988, Gayle Barrus was 30 years old, and she lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. She was one-third of a set of triplets. Barrus had 3 children of her own. Barrus was trained as a nursing assistant, but in the fall of 1988, she was working full-time as a waitress. On the night of October 8, 1988, Barrus was at a tavern in Battle Creek. Around 11 p.m., she was seen leaving the tavern with a blonde woman in her late 20s. A few hours later, between 3 and 4 a.m., she was spotted at a local coffee shop. She was with the same woman. They left with a man who was described as being between the ages of 38 and 40. He had a mustache and possibly a light beard. Gayle Barrus never made it home. She also didn't contact her family, including her children. This was extremely out of character for her, so she was reported missing. Barrus's car was found parked at the coffee shop where she was last seen. The police looked for her, but for 2 weeks, no trace of her was found. Then, 16 days after she went missing, her body was found by a group of hunters. It was in a rural area next to a road that runs along the North Branch Kalamazoo River. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. The police investigated the case and they came up with 2 persons of interest. Both were friends of Barrus. One was a 24-year-old man named Roger Plato. Plato had just been released from prison a few months earlier after serving time for robbery. On October 22nd, 3 days before Barrus's body was found, 2 officers confronted Plato in the parking lot of a grocery store. However, they weren't confronting him about Barrus's disappearance. Instead, he was the suspect in the kidnapping and rape of another woman that took place 2 days earlier. There was a struggle, and Plato was shot to death. The police kept a sample of Plato's blood, and he was cremated. A few years later, Plato's DNA was compared to male DNA that was found in Barrus's underwear. The crime lab concluded that it wasn't his DNA, so the case went cold. Over 30 years went by. In 2019, the police decided to get a DNA sample from the second person of interest. The problem was that he had died 10 years earlier, so they had his body exhumed. It turned out his DNA didn't match, so he was cleared as a suspect. At the end of 2020, there was an audit of the evidence in the case. The investigators found the blood sample they had taken from Roger Plato. They had it tested again. On January 5, 2021, the crime lab had the results. The DNA found in Gayle Barrus' underwear belonged to Roger Plato. It turned out that it wasn't matched when it was originally tested because DNA technology wasn't sophisticated enough. But in the years since the initial testing was done, DNA technology had improved and it definitively matched the DNA. After 32 years, the murder of Gayle Barrus was finally closed. Number 2. Sylvia Mae Qualyle. In the early 1980s, Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, was home to about 5,000 people. It is a suburb that is about 7 miles from downtown Denver. One of the residents was 34-year-old Sylvia Mae Qualyle. Qualyle was a secretary at an architectural firm, but her true passions were art and food. In 1981, she started her own business that made wedding cakes. She also made pottery. Qualyle was close with her parents. In fact, their home was only 150 feet away from her own home. She had coffee with them every morning. Around 8 o'clock on the morning of August 8, 1981, her father went over to her home. In the living room, he found something he'll probably never forget. It was the dead body of his 34-year-old daughter. She was nude and lying on her back on the floor. A white, bloody towel was covering her face. He immediately called 911. Sylvia Quayle's death had been brutal. She had most likely been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled, stabbed 3 times in the back, and shot in the top of the head with a .22 caliber gun. The knife was from her kitchen and was found close to her body. The gun was not recovered. The stab wounds were the cause of death, and the gunshots were considered the secondary cause of death. The phone line had been cut both inside and outside the house. It appeared that the killer entered the home by removing a window screen. No arrests were made in the wake of the murder, and it wasn't long before the case went cold. A little less than 2 years after the murder, in April 1983, a 36-year-old drifter named Otis Toole was arrested on arson charges in Jacksonville, Florida. 2 months later, Toole's friend and sometime lover, 48-year-old Henry Lee Lucas, was arrested. In custody, Lucas started confessing to a slew of murders that he and Toole supposedly committed. Toole then started confessing to several murders. One of those was the murder of 34-year-old Sylvia Qualyle. 7 days after Quayle's murder, Toole was supposedly 2,000 miles away in Hollywood, Florida, where he kidnapped and murdered 6-year-old Adam Walsh. Toole was subsequently charged with Quayle's murder, but he never stood trial for the murder. Instead, he was eventually convicted of 6 murders in Florida. He was given the death penalty for 2 of the murders, but those sentences were later commuted to life sentences. So, in total, he received 6 life sentences for the 6 murder convictions. This does not include the murder of Adam Walsh. Although Otis Toole was the prime suspect in the murder of Adam Walsh, he was never charged with the crime. A decade went by, and it was assumed that Otis Toole had killed Sylvia Qualyle. But then, in 1993, testing was done on genetic material that was found on a rug in Quayle's home. It did not belong to Toole. So the charges regarding Quayle's murder against Toole were dropped, and the case became cold again. In 2000, the DNA was submitted to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. But no match was found. 20 years later, in early 2020, the Cherry Hills Valley Police Department gave the DNA sample to a genetic genealogy company called United Data Connect. The company provided the police with a possible suspect, 62-year-old David Dwayne Anderson. Anderson, who was 22 at the time of the murder, lived in the Cherry Hills Valley area, and he had a criminal record. Between 1976 and 1988, he was arrested 8 times for burglaries. He was sentenced to 3 years in a state prison. In early 2021, Anderson was living in Cozad, Nebraska. In January 2021, officers watched his home and collected some trash he threw out. This included a vanilla Coke can, a water bottle, a spiced rum bottle, and a can of beer. DNA found on the vanilla Coke can was matched to semen found at the crime scene. On February 10, 2021, 40 years after Sylvia Quayle's murder, David Anderson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. If he's convicted, he could be sentenced to life with a chance of parole after 20 years, which was the maximum sentence when Quayle was killed. Number 1. Lori Nesson. In autumn 1974, 15-year-old Lori Nesson was a sophomore in high school. She lived with her family in Columbus, Ohio. On the night of September 27, 1974, Lori attended a football game. Then she went to a house party. Around 12:30 a.m., she started walking home alone. Sadly, she never made it there. Early the next morning, her body was found in a ditch about 5 miles from where she was last seen. She was nude, and her clothes were found scattered across a few miles. The medical examiner had a hard time determining what the cause of death was. He thought she had been poisoned, but couldn't determine what poison was used. Instead of labeling her death a homicide, the medical examiner said it was undetermined. The cause of death was asphyxia of undetermined origin. Since it wasn't a homicide, not much was done to investigate her death. It wasn't long before the case was considered cold. Her family knew this was a mistake because they did not think she would strip down naked and lie down in a ditch and die. In 2019, 45 years after the death, Lori's family asked the police to reopen the case. They did, and the detective who took on the case noticed some problems with the autopsy report. He looked at the photos and saw unexplained bruises, and there were cuts on her lips. So he had the medical examiner review the autopsy report. After the review, in September 2020, the medical examiner changed the death from undetermined to homicide. In December 2020, 10 TV, a television station in Columbus, did a story about Lori's death being labeled a homicide. The report caught the attention of an unidentified woman. On March 9, 1975, the woman's 17-year-old cousin, Karen Adams, was walking home alone in Columbus. She told her parents that she was going to visit a friend, but actually, she met up with her boyfriend. Tragically, she never made it home. Her body was found the next day in a ditch about 4 miles from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The viewer thought that there were a lot of similarities between the murders of Lori and her cousin. Both were teenage girls who were kidnapped as they were walking home alone. They were both found in a ditch miles away from where they were last seen. The murders also happened within 5 months of each other. Karen's murder, like Lori's, had been cold for decades. The difference was that Karen Adams' murder was eventually solved. In early 2011, evidence from her crime scene was submitted to the crime lab. They found DNA belonging to 2 men. One set of DNA was matched to a 71-year-old sex offender named Robert W. Meyer. Meyer had a disturbing criminal record. On May 2, 1962, Meyer, who was 22 years old, broke into the apartment of an 81-year-old man named John Blevin with an accomplice. Meyer beat Blevin with a hammer, and then he and his accomplice left with $70. Blevin died 11 days later in the hospital. Meyer was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He ended up serving about 10 years of prison for the murder. During his time in prison, he met a man named Charles Weber. Both men were out of prison in the early 1970s. In 1977, they were arrested for kidnapping, raping, and attempting to murder 2 women. Meyer served about 23 years in prison for the crimes, and he was released in 2001. He was a registered sex offender, and he was not arrested again until his DNA was linked to the murder of Karen Adams in 2011. He was arrested in September 2011, 37 years after Karen's murder. He pleaded guilty to the murder, and in May 2012, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. After Meyer was incarcerated, a detective paid him a visit. He asked him why he killed Karen. He said that was just what he did. He would go around looking for women to kidnap and sexually assault. At the time, the police did not identify his accomplice in Karen's murder, but they suspected it was Charles Weber. They didn't identify him because they didn't have a sample of his DNA. He had died in 1992 at the age of 53, and he had been cremated. After Meyer pleaded guilty, the police told the media that they thought Meyer and Weber committed other murders. When Karen Adams' cousin saw the news story about Lori Nesson's murder, she suggested looking at Robert Meyer. He had died in prison a few years after he was sentenced for the murder of Karen. The police submitted the evidence from Lori's murder for DNA testing. They found 2 sets of male DNA. One set of DNA belonged to Robert Meyer. The police tracked down the son of Charles Weber, and he gave them a cheek swab. Testing confirmed that the second man's DNA was Weber's. They also confirmed that his DNA was found on evidence from Karen Adams' murder. The police announced in March 2021 that after 46 years, the murder of Lori Nesson was finally closed. The police suspect that Robert Meyer and Charles Weber committed more murders that have not been linked to them. They said they are continuing to investigate them. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In it, we profile one of the most infamous serial killers who ever lived. You can find Into the Killing on iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Deezer, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.